me do that. Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the Philosophy and Children's Literature webinar. My name is Beth Yates and I'm the Children's Consultant from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'm going to be your host and question moderator today, but our presenter today is Jana Moore-Lone, the Executive Director of the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization, otherwise known as PLATO, and she's also the affiliate associate professor of philosophy at the University of Washington. I'd also like to thank DePauw University's Prindle Institute for Ethics, whose staff member Christian Weishart is here today and who helped us set up this webinar. And also Christian will be chiming in later to share some resources. So we're so happy to be working with them and to have them today. Before we jump in, I do have a few more announcements. First of all, to register for other webinars or trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library, and it's under Services for Libraries. This session is 1 hour, so you're eligible to receive 1 LEU for this presentation. If you're watching a recording of this webinar, instructions for how to obtain your LEU are in the video's description on YouTube. Or you can also find those instructions on the Indiana State Library's continuing education website under LEU policies. But in short, when you watch a recording, your director or someone in HR at your library should create an LEU certificate for you because they're the ones who can verify that you watched the webinar. Okay, I think that's everything I have and we're ready to get started. And again, our presenter today is Jana Moore-Lone of PLATO and the University of Washington. And we are so happy to have her here today. So please take it away, Jana.
Thank you, Beth.
Spotlight you too.
Okay. I'm very happy to be here. We work with a lot of librarians, and I'm always really thrilled to be able to talk with librarians about children's literature and children's thinking, because I know it is something that many of you think about a lot. So I wanted to talk just a little bit generally first about children's philosophical thinking. So I'll talk for a little while, and then I'm going to have us do something more interactive. As I think we all know, children ask big questions all the time, and many of them are philosophical from very young ages. Questions like, are numbers real? Or do dogs talk? Or why are some people mean to other people? These are the kinds of questions that aren't resolvable by Googling them, and they lend themselves to really thoughtful conversations when we open ourselves to having these kinds of conversations with children. Because even though children ask these kinds of questions so often, we don't tend to think of children as philosophical. So why is that? I think that there are two main reasons, and one has to do with our views about philosophy, and the other has to do with our views of children. So philosophy is often seen, especially in this country, but in many places, as a very esoteric discipline that belongs in the academy and is inaccessible to most people. We think you have to have a PhD or an advanced degree in order to do philosophy. So we don't tend to see our musings about the world as philosophical. But I think we're wrong about that. Every time we think, is this the right thing to do? Or what's the purpose of my life? We're doing philosophy. Philosophy is really part of being a human being, and I think it belongs to everyone. And it does not just belong within the walls of the academy. And children often are most interested in wondering about these kinds of big questions because the world is so new to them. But unfortunately, they are very much underestimated in general. And I think in no area is that truer than in their capacities for deep and sustained reflection about difficult subjects. People will often say to me when I tell them what I do, oh, that's too hard for children. Children can't do philosophy. But actually, children are quite philosophical and very eager to talk about their philosophical questions. And one of the best prompts for these kinds of discussions are children's books. Philosophy is everywhere in children's literature. I think that children's authors are much more aware than most adults of children's philosophical propensities. And one of my happiest discoveries when I was a new parent and a graduate student in philosophy was the philosophical suggestiveness of so much of good children's literature. Lots of important questions and ideas, subjects such as the meaning of happiness, justice and fairness, the relationship between freedom and community, the nature of beauty, emerge not only from the works of classic and contemporary philosophers, but also from picture books and other children's literature. And these prompts, as you will, of philosophical thinking are not didactic. They're very subtle and inviting, and they create an environment of safety for discussing these really challenging and difficult questions. So as a librarian, how do you engage in these kinds of conversations with children? Well, if you're working with young children and doing a read aloud, you can read the story, and then you might ask the children, what questions does this make you wonder about? Or working with older children and teenagers, you can just ask a question yourself or express your own thought. You know, that book made me wonder about what it means to be a good friend. Did you think about that reading this book? And central to this whole enterprise is that children's ideas take center stage. That's what matters. Really, the idea is that we can take seriously children's perspectives, what they think about these questions, because they have a lot to offer us in making our own ways of thinking broader and richer. So there's no agenda, really. We're not teaching children philosophy through literature. We're really just trying to generate a thoughtful philosophical discussion, and literature can be a wonderful conduit to that. So in these kinds of conversations, then, there's kind of a shift, because adults in working with young people often see ourselves as the advisors, the teachers, the experts. But in this kind of engagement, it's very different, because these questions are not questions that we have the answers to. We don't know any more than the children do what happiness means, for example. So we're kind of a co-inquirer. We're working with children to kind of better understand how to think about these questions, to have a deeper awareness of the philosophical dimension of our experiences. We're much more equal in these exchanges, I think, because we both bring something important. Adults bring, I think, a greater conceptual sophistication and life experience. And children bring a very fresh perspective and an openness to exploring all possible views. What adults might characterize as children's naivete becomes a strength in philosophy, because they're unafraid to think about a question imaginatively. They don't worry about making a mistake or sounding silly. When I talk about philosophical questions with children, children will always say things like, oh, I said that, but actually I've changed my mind, or I think I was wrong, in ways that adults are much more reticent about. They kind of throw themselves into these conversations with relative unreservedness. So I thought I would give you some examples of some books that I think are particularly philosophically interesting. And I'll say that most of these are picture books, but I have used these books with people from young children in preschool through my college students. So I'm going to share my screen here. Can everyone see this? Okay, great. So the first, let's see if I can do it better. Okay, so the first is The Ugly Duckling, which I think that most of you probably know. Can you all see this?
I'm sorry, Jana.
Yeah, no, I've got it. Can you all see this give subtitles a try thing, or is that just showing up for me?
Yeah, we're seeing your preview screen.
Yeah, okay, let's do this differently. Okay, how's that?
Yep, that works. Sure.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah.
So I assume you all know the story of the ugly duckling, which raises lots of really interesting questions about ugliness and beauty. For example, was the ugly duckling ugly? And if yes, why? And did the ugly duckling stop being ugly at the end of the story? And you might think about, like, if you're no longer ugly, were you ever ugly? What does ugly mean? Can you be both ugly and beautiful? The second example is The Velveteen Rabbit, written by Marjorie Williams in 1922, which I assume you also all know, which raises very explicitly questions about what it means to be real. How do you know something is real? Can loving something make it real? And then, is there anything in the world that isn't real in some ways? Are some things more real than others? A third example is Horton Hears a Who by Dr. Seuss, published in 1954, which I assume you all know, but just in case, the story is about Horton the elephant, who is splashing in a pool, and he hears a small noise, like a small yelp. And he sees nothing but Dr. Seuss tells us a small speck of dust blowing past through the air. And Horton thinks that there's a very small creature on top of this dust speck who's afraid that the dust will blow into the pool. And because a person's a person, no matter how small, as Dr. Seuss says, Horton tries to protect this being. And the other animals in the jungle who are watching this think Horton has lost it. And they start to talk about imprisoning him and getting him, mental health treatment. And finally, the whole community of people that's on this dust speck, or beings that are on this dust speck, make enough noise that the community around Horton, the animals in the jungle, recognize that there actually are people on this dust speck. So this raises a lot of interesting questions about knowledge and belief, such as, why did Horton know there was a person on the dust speck when he heard that sound? How did he know it? He was very sure. What made him so sure? And why didn't the other animals believe him? Do you have to see, hear, or touch something yourself in order to believe it's there? Can you think of something you know exists, even though you can't see or hear or touch it? And by the way, if anyone's interested, I'm always happy to share my slides. And so you can reach out to Beth and I'm happy to send them on. The final example I'm going to use is from the Harry Potter books. I use the Harry Potter books a lot in my work with students, and they are full of examples that are philosophically suggestive. This one is from the first book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and from chapter 12, The Mirror of Erised, in which there's a mirror that Harry Potter, the lead character, comes across that will, if you look in it, show you your deepest desires. And when he finds Harry staring into the mirror, the headmaster of the school where Harry attends tells him that the mirror can give him neither truth nor knowledge. So this raises interesting questions about what we can know about ourselves, whether other people can know things about us that we do not know. What do you think you would see looking into this mirror? And would the mirror be able to tell you something you don't already know? Because if you don't already know the deepest desire of your heart, can it really be your deepest desire? And what does Dumbledore mean when he tells Harry the mirror cannot give him knowledge or truth? Can images like those in the mirror actually give us knowledge, and in what way? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And then I'm going to show you all a film, which is just a short 4-minute film. This is a story that I use frequently in classrooms of all ages. It's from Arnold Lobel's Frog and Toad Stories, which I assume many of you know, which are among my favorites. I think they are among the most philosophically interesting and suggestive of all children's literature. And this story is called Alone. And I will, again, share my screen. Oops, hold on, that didn't look right. Try it again. Okay.
Toad went to Frog's house. He found a note on the door. The note said, "Dear Toad, I am not at home. I went out. I want to be alone." "Alone?" said Toad. "Frog has me for a friend. Why does he want to be alone?" Toad looked through the windows. He looked in the garden. He did not see Frog. Toad went to the woods. Frog was not there. He went to the meadow. Frog was not there. Toad went down to the river. There was Frog. He was sitting on an island by himself. "Poor Frog," said Toad. "He must be very sad. I will cheer him up." Toad ran home. He made sandwiches. He made a pitcher of iced tea. He put everything in a basket. Toad hurried back to the river. "Frog," he shouted, "it's me, your best friend, Toad." Frog was too far away to hear. Toad took off his jacket and waved it like a flag. Frog was too far away to see. Toad shouted and waved, but it was no use. Frog sat on the island. He did not see or hear Toad. A turtle swam by. "Turtle," said Toad, "carry me to the island. Frog is there. He wants to be alone." "If Frog wants to be alone," said the turtle, "why don't you leave him alone?" "Maybe you are right," said Toad. "Maybe Frog does not want to see me. Maybe he does not want me to be his friend anymore." "Yes, maybe," said the turtle as he swam to the island. "Frog," cried Toad, "I am sorry for all the dumb things I do. I am sorry for all the silly things I say. Please, be my friend again." Toad slipped off the turtle. With a splash, he fell in the river. Frog pulled Toad up onto the island. Toad looked in the basket. The sandwiches were wet. The pitcher of iced tea was empty. "Our lunch is spoiled," said Toad. "I made it for you, Frog, so that you would be happy." "But Toad," said Frog, "I am happy. I am very happy. This morning, when I woke up, I felt good because the sun was shining. I felt good because I was a frog. And I felt good because I have you for a friend. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to think about how fine everything is." "Oh," said Toad, "I guess that is a very good reason for wanting to be alone." "Now," said Frog, "I will be glad not to be alone. Let's eat lunch." Frog and Toad stayed on the island all afternoon. They ate wet sandwiches without iced tea. They were two close friends sitting alone together. The end.
On every vacation at a verbal.
Okay. So what ordinarily I would actually do next is to ask all of you what kinds of questions the story makes you wonder about. Often that's what I do when I work in classrooms with young people. But because we're very short on time today, I am just going to put some questions in the chat to kind of start us off. And these are questions that have often come up from children when we've read this story. And then I'm going to ask Beth to set up breakout rooms for you all. And what I'd like you to do, so you'll be in a breakout room of maybe 5 or so people, is to choose one or more of these questions, or you can come up with questions of your own that the story made you wonder about, and have a conversation about the questions or question. And then we'll come back together and have a larger group conversation. I'll plan to pop into each of the breakout rooms and talk with you a little bit about what's coming up for you in the breakout rooms. But first I'll just read the questions aloud so you can have a little chance to think about them. The questions I put up are: 1, is there a difference between being alone and being lonely? How does our culture view solitude, and why do you think this is the case? And finally, what does it mean to be alone together? Which is how the story ends. The frog and toad spend the rest of the day alone together, which I think is just a really interesting phrase. So Beth, if the breakout rooms are ready, let's set them up. You'll be in the breakout rooms. Let's see, it's 11:27, probably till about 11:40. And you'll get let's say a 2-minute warning that the rooms are going to close. And then you'll see that they'll close in 60 seconds and they'll automatically close at that point. And as I say, I'll pop in and check in with all of you. Okay.
All right, I have opened all rooms and I think you might have to accept. I think it might pop up a message on your screen and you have to accept it. And Christian and Jana, I didn't assign the 3 of us to a room. It's like they're slowly getting in there. There we go.
Okay, well, I'll give them maybe a minute to get started and then I'll pop in each room.
Okay, and I'm going to pause the recording until we come back from the breakouts.
Great.
It's always fun to watch everyone boop, 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 boop. Pop back in. Welcome back.
Okay, is everyone back? Not quite, looks like almost. So I was able to pop into some, but not all of the rooms and heard lots of interesting conversations. And so I'm wondering if some of you might be able to share some of what came up in the conversations. I'm sorry, we don't have more time. I know it was sort of an abbreviated example, but I wanted to give you a little taste of what this is like, because I've had conversations about this story, for example, that have gone on for 40 minutes with elementary school students. And as you can see, it raises lots of different questions, and one question sort of leads to another. So does anyone have anything that came up in the conversation that you'd like to share with the larger group? And you can either put it in the chat or feel free to just start talking. Penelope said that one of the people in the group said the difference between being alone and being lonely is physical presence versus a mental state. Interesting. So being alone is a physical presence and being lonely is a mental state. Yeah, Michael?
Something that came up in our group was being alone was seen as more of a choice, where you may move yourself to a isolated spot and use it to do whatever you want to do, reflect or just have space. And being lonely was seemed to be more like a state of mind of being maybe sad or unhappy, or it was not so much by choice. You could be in a setting crowded and feel lonely still.
And then there were some conversations about the differences between introverts and extroverts, and noting that even though extroverts sometimes need time alone to recharge, just like introverts do. I can't remember who said it, but in one of the rooms that I was in for a little while, someone noted, and maybe you can speak up, that, which I hadn't thought about before, that solitude, while, we live in a culture that often, especially for children, pushes people to be busy and social, that solitude can also be a privilege, and that for some people, solitude isn't really accessible. I thought that was really interesting. I can't remember who said it, but I'd love to hear more about that part of the conversation, because I was only there for a little while.
I think that was our group, but you encapsulated that very well. In thinking about that, I think just the idea of a lot of times children are expected to be busy all the time, and not offered the choice or the opportunity. But I think what was developed from our group was that often, speaking from their experience with their own children, some members said that is often where children are the most creative or innovative, when they're allowed that time for free range thinking by themselves. And anybody else can add from our group.
I wasn't in the group, but I could see large families that don't have, the space, or folks who don't have the privilege of having a house with, each kid gets their own bedroom, I could see that.
Yeah, and I think someone else in the group said, as a parent of several children, that some solitude was a need that was a privilege for her, that she really had to kind of work to get sometimes, which I thought was also an interesting way to think about it. And then, yeah, there were a couple of conversations, I think, about reading books in a group versus someone on their cell phone. So that, if you bring a book to a group, you're seen as like antisocial, but if you're on your phone, it's more acceptable, which is, I think we could have a whole conversation about that and the relationship between phones and being connected to other people or not connected to other people. And Penelope says, good reason to put Hoopla or Libby on your phone. That's good. Other comments or insights that came up in the groups that anyone would like to share? Sometimes being alone is simply escaping reality. So, Brian Lynn, am I pronouncing that correctly? Yes, okay. That's really interesting. I'm kind of curious about what you mean by escaping reality. Can you say a little bit more about that, either aloud or in the chat? And while just thinking, any other thoughts? Okay, well, I wanted to make a little time for, Dana said, we discussed how literature reflects being alone, such as stereotype of the hermit, alone and lonely without people. Yeah, that's interesting. Literature's views of, there's sort of the lonely hero, but there's also the sort of, the hermit, as you say. I wanted to make a little time too for questions. If any of you had questions for me, and you can either, again, you can put them in the chat or feel free to raise your hands or.
I have a question.
Yeah, Betsy.
Yeah, related to this, I was, we were talking in our group about different ages, and I still sort of have this question about like I realized for myself that I had a hard time sort of understanding how, say, a 3 or a 4-year-old, a very young person hearing this story would, think about this, because I don't, think of very young children as wanting to be alone. But then the more I thought about it, we had a little discussion in the group, is just how certain things, whether like poetry, seem to resonate for a few people, that certain activities lend themselves to connecting with ourselves, and So I'm curious to you, for, from you, like, in terms of ages, is, especially for the very young, how do they express being alone versus, a teenager, obviously, always, that seems to come up for a teenager, say. So,
Yeah, I mean, my experiences in doing this story and other stories with pretty wide ranges of age is that not only your particular age or impacts how you see the story, but a whole host of other things. So I hesitate to, generalize about all 4-year-olds, for example, and how they might respond to the story, or all. But I would say, the way I do these stories, as I said, I mean, I wouldn't normally put questions there. And if I were doing this with a group of 3 and 4-year-olds, for example, I might say, what does this make you think about? Often with that group, preschool age students, I'll have them draw while we're listening to the story. So they might draw, a picture of a friend or a picture of being alone in their home. And that might spark a conversation about being alone versus being with friends. But I think even very young children, at least in my experience, even as young as 4, I haven't really worked with younger than 4 doing this, are aware of sometimes the wanting to be alone, wanting to be by themselves. And also of a lot of times what comes up with younger children is Toad's fear that Frog was unhappy. And talking about, when your friend tells you they want to be alone, what do you think? Why do you think they're sad? And how sometimes friends will say, I want to be alone, as a way actually of asking for help, but not explicitly saying that. And they do want someone to respond by saying, are you sure? Are you okay? And so we'll have those kinds of conversations. Often they'll be maybe more about friendship than they might be about solitude per se. But again, I hesitate to generalize because everyone's different. I don't know if that's helpful, Betsy.
yeah, thank you. Just again, like, it's okay that I can't necessarily imagine it. And just the idea that to not have that preconceived idea of where the conversation is going to go. You don't need to steer it. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think that can be the biggest challenge for adults doing this work, honestly, because it's really, you have to let go of control and you have to walk into it not knowing where it's going to go and being willing to just follow where the children are taking it, and helping them to listen to each other and to connect and to make the conversation deeper, but not caring about which particular questions they end up wanting to talk about or how the subject might change. Someone asked if I have any advice for librarians, teachers on how to facilitate discussion with a large group of of children. So when you say large, I mean, I frequently work, for example, with like 30 kids. Are you talking about larger than that? Or is that what you mean? 30, okay. Yeah, I mean, really, I'd say this works really well with groups of 30 or so kids. So you read a story, you can either ask them, depending on how much time you have, what questions does this make you wonder about? And usually if I'm going to do that, I'll start off by talking about questions, big questions that are interesting to talk about versus questions you can Google and find the answer to or look up, and that this is the former rather than the latter, right? And then so I might ask them, what questions does this make them think about? And you can put them up on a whiteboard and then have them choose which question to talk about. Often though, what I'll do so I'll read a story and I'll do maybe turn and talk or small groups and ask them together to come up with a question that's interesting. And then we'll choose one of the questions to start to talk about. Or if it's a story like Frog and Toad's Dragons and Giants, which is obviously about bravery, you might just ask them, what does it mean to be brave? Or do you think Frog and Toad were brave? So you can ask the question to kind of start the conversation going. And then really, at least in my experience, the children it's so refreshing for most children to have a space where they can just talk about these big questions without the right answer lurking somewhere in the background that they're supposed to be getting to. And so making that space for them is just in itself is really important. And they will then take the conversation, and you can help them by, you know, if everyone's agreeing, for example, you can say, oh, well, have you thought about this, which complicates the question a little bit, etc.
Can I just chime in on top of that and say, hopefully some of you who work in libraries have heard of dialogic reading. I talk about it in my Every Child Ready to Read training. Dialogic reading is having a dialogue with the kids while you read, dialogic dialogue. And this strikes me as like one thing that you could ask questions about as you're reading the story. It's just another version of dialogic reading, really. Giving them that space and open-ended questions and an opportunity to share. And so I think it would be amazing to do like an elementary aged really focus and have a really big open discussion. But if you want to just kind of start dabbling, I could see throwing, using one book during story time and throwing in a couple of these questions. You don't have to have a big, deep discussion for a half an hour with preschoolers, but you could do some of it.
And I will say, for those of you who are parents, it's a really wonderful way to connect with your own children, to when you're reading stories together, to ask them, do you think Frog and Toad were brave, or whatever? And it can be part of the reading experience that you have with your own children. You ever find some books you could use being tried or part of a banned books list? I have not had that experience here, but I'm in the part of the country where that is, I think, less of an issue than some other parts of the country. So I have not had, and it's certainly not a silly question at all. I think that our approach, which is sort of not really an answer to the question, but the larger question, I think, is that we really trust the children to take these conversations where they need to take them. So I have had conversations, not necessarily that are part of a banned books list, but that were conversations that the classroom teacher was a little bit uncomfortable with, because the children raised questions that were very sensitive, but we kind of go with it anyway. And I think the children really find that having a space where they can talk about the things that matter to them is pretty empowering. But I think this is a whole question, Brylan, that you raise about literature and banned books that, we could have a whole nother webinar to talk about, because there are a lot of things to talk about.
Now, I do want to recognize it's 2:59, and technically we are supposed to be done in a minute. So, and I want Christian to have a chance to share her resources. So I do see your question, Kathy. If you work at a library in Indiana, if you want to, I'll share my email address, because I have some, I'm happy to talk to you about that sort of thing.
And I'm also, I'm happy to I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to have people reach out to me. I get these kinds of questions all the time. And I would also say that we have lots of resources and Christian's going to talk about this too, but we have lots of resources for teachers and families about how to do this and ways that you can do this, etc. That will respond also to some of these questions. Thanks for putting all that in the chat, Christian. And I'll let you know.
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quick, the Play-Doh, I put a bunch of links here. The Play-Doh toolkit, I think, does have a lot of resources specifically for that age group that you were talking about, Kathy. So that might be helpful in addition to emailing Jana. I also wanted to draw your attention to the Prindle Institute's website, Teaching Children Philosophy. It has over 200 discussion guides that are free to print, download, and email. And so if you feel like you maybe need a little bit of help generating some of these questions, or trying to figure out what kind of direction maybe to point children into, we've got 200 books up there. A lot of them are classic books. The Play-Doh website as well has many discussion guides for a bunch of common books. So yeah, and I also want to recommend I did a podcast interview with Jana about this topic that's really interesting, and I linked that in the chat as well. So
we had
sorry.
question.
Sorry, I have one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're in Central Indiana and you're interested in doing this type of thing, we run workshops for educators as well. So I put my email in that list of things. So feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in doing that in Indiana.
I was just going to say, Kathy had asked, how will I be able to access this meeting? Are you referring to the recording of this webinar? If so, I will send that out to everybody who registered. And I'll send it out also with follow-up info, where I will also include all the links that Christian has shared. So I'll put that all together in an email, and I will send that out to you all. Just a reminder, though, that the recording will take a little longer. It can take up to 30 days. It's usually much less, but I have to give that disclaimer. So I've put the LEU request form in the chat, just FYI. So if you need a continuing education certificate that says you earned an LEU for today, make sure you fill out that form, please. If you're watching this recording in the future, you'll have to have someone at your library create that certificate for you. And I want to thank Jana and Christian for their time today and for presenting for us. That was really interesting, and I really appreciate it. I think I can stay on for a few more minutes. So if folks do have more questions that they want to pose to Jana, if you are both available, we can hang out for a couple more minutes. But I did want to get all the busy, or not busy work, but all the paperwork out of the way for folks who have to leave. And I'm going to stop the recording. So if you're watching the recording, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.